All right, we are recording. Hi, Father. Thank you again for joining me for another conversation with you about an important theological topic that we're going to continue from off of our last conversation, which was about the existence of God from God's beginning to God's end, from all we know to all we don't know. And we're going to transition that today into the second part of this that I've received tons of questions and debates from sixth graders about, which is the transubstantiation of the Eucharist and the Eucharist itself. I'm not kidding. These sixth graders have serious questions about the Eucharist, transubstantiation. Is it the real body and blood of Christ, or are we just kidding ourselves? Is it symbolic, or is it real? So what do you think we should be talking about with sixth graders to get them to understand the Eucharist?
Well, you know, the bread and the wine, the bread doesn't look like bread for them. It's a flat piece of unleavened bread. The wine is in a cup that they can't see. And so it comes down to faith. To believe in the Eucharist, you have to have faith that somehow what the church and what Jesus did at the Last Supper is really true. At the Last Supper, Jesus takes the bread, the Passover meal, and he said, "This is my body," and he breaks it and he shares it with his apostles. Then he takes the cup of wine. They had 4 different cups of wine, I guess. And he takes one of those towards the end of the meal, but this is my blood, which is shed for you. Well, for an ordinary person who has no faith, there's nothing that they can see that changes. The wine still smells like wine, and it looks like wine, and it tastes like wine. And the unleavened bread still tastes like a piece of cardboard, or, not real bread that they're accustomed to. And so there's no significant, there's no external change that goes on. And so the change that we believe in has to come from faith. Faith that what Jesus said is true, that what the church continues to teach is true, that there is a substantial change of substance, that the substance of bread is no longer bread, it becomes the body of Christ, and the substance of the wine, which becomes the blood of Christ. Now, because it's a substantial change in that sense, doesn't mean that there are accidental changes, like the wine doesn't change into blood or look like blood, or even smell or taste like blood, or the bread doesn't look like the body of Christ, the flesh. But that all comes from faith. And if you don't have the faith to believe that, well, then it's going to look like bread and it's going to look like wine. And there's nothing in the world that's going to prove it to them, because there's no physical way we can prove that this bread and wine changes into the body and blood of Christ. It all has to come from a basis of believing what Jesus said.
So I had one sixth grader say to me when I asked, what's stopping you from having faith in this being the body and blood of Christ? She said whenever she goes up to communion, she is always expecting it to be actual body and actual blood. She says whenever she goes up, she's somewhat disappointed. She's sort of expecting someday she'll go up and it will actually be flesh, it'll actually be blood. And I think that's a really fascinating thought, because like you just said, it relies on faith. It relies on, you're doing this action because you are joining in communion with Jesus. So what do you think about, what do you say to someone like that, like expecting it to be blood? Then she said, one of my favorite things she said was, she goes, I went up there and I looked in the cup and it was just juice.
If I gave her a full glass of that juice, she'd be on the floor.
Yeah, right.
Unconscious.
Right.
So she knows it's wine.
Right. She knows it's wine.
But not blood.
Right.
So, I don't know how to, I don't know how to tell a person, that it's not, I don't know where they got the expectation. Well, I guess it's easy to get the expectation. The teacher said, this is the body of Christ and this is the blood of Christ, and to have the expectation that it truly changes somewhere along the line before she gets up to, to the communion. But I guess in the reality of things, a sixth grader, expectations and an adult's expectation are, the reality of that is different. And so somewhere along the line, she's going to have to grow to understand that this is not a physical change. And to try to say this is a substantial change means nothing to a sixth grader, I'm sure. And to anybody who hasn't taken any philosophy, and even if I'd taken philosophy for 2 years out of my seminary life, how do I explain substantial change? I don't know. And so it does come down to an understanding of the reality of who God is, who Jesus is, the Last Supper and Jesus' promise, and somehow to believe that what Jesus says is true, and somehow to believe that this, whether it changes or not, that this truly is the body and blood of Christ. Now, there have been supposedly, I don't know if these are actual things that have happened, but hosts that priests have had at Mass that have broken open and that bled blood, and supposedly real blood. But who knows whether those things are supposedly scientifically shown to be real blood, that kind of thing. I don't think you can go by that kind of proof, because who's gonna, some people believe that, some people have great devotion to that kind of thing, but there's a lot of people who certainly don't and don't need to have that kind of understanding of that. Let me just tell you a cute story. This is a second grader making her first communion. She was the daughter of a guy who made wine in California. And I was at a funeral, and he came up to me afterwards and said, my daughter, when she was growing up, we used to always give her a little taste of different kinds of wine just to see, what it tastes like and if she can identify the different kinds of wine. So she goes up to her first communion, takes the host, then she goes to the cup, and she takes a drink of the cup, and she says, Zinfandel. So, that's what her experience was, that this is, the body, the blood of Christ, but it's Zinfandel, she knew that. So, a second grader, a sixth grader, a full-grown adult, they will all have different understandings of what that might be in terms of what Eucharist is. But ultimately, the adult, the growing understanding in our faith is that this truly is the body of Christ, and truly is the blood of Christ. And whether the sixth grader is not able to get there yet, because her reality is that this is going to be the real body and blood of Christ, and when I drink that cup, it's going to be blood. Well, somewhere along the line, she will hopefully mature in understanding of what the meaning of what Christ said at the Last Supper is, and know that this is more symbolic and is real, but it's more, rather than the outward appearance of things, it's the substance of things that changes.
Which in a way, so in this, right now in sixth grade religion, we're talking about your faith journey. So to sort of put your experience in this idea of a journey, you're going somewhere. There's a beginning and there's an end, right? So there's this continuation of your journey. And I think one element of that journey, especially for a Catholic, is when you recognize that the Eucharist is also having an impact on you, on your interior, on your way of life, how when you reflect your actions and your thoughts and your deeds and your prayer to being directed towards receiving the Eucharist, you have changed your interior. You have changed your substance, just like the transubstantiation's happening with the Eucharist at Mass.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, and you know, it's just a growing awareness. You know, the Eucharist is at the heart of our faith in a lot of ways, and so, you know, Mass is central to our belief of who Jesus is and how he enters into our lives and feeds us and nourishes us and does all those kinds of things, not just symbolically, but in a real kind of way. But somewhere along the line, that sixth grader has to come to an understanding of, you know, symbolism and how we use that in our sacramental life and how that becomes a reality for us when we begin to understand just what Jesus was saying to us and what the reality of his presence in the Eucharist is.
Because he literally says in the Gospels, I am the bread of life.
Right. And he said, this is my body and this is my blood. So we've had that for all these thousands of years.
Do you think then, so I think oftentimes what happens with a lot of Catholics I know is that they prepare for Mass, you know, oftentimes most will go to, I shouldn't say most, some will go to confession before going to Mass, or they'll fast a little bit or whatever. They'll do some preparation before Mass. But then what's interesting is that there's almost a change once they've received communion and leave Mass. There's not that continuation of the expectation from Christ of what we're supposed to do in our lives. Because you say at the end of Mass, go now in peace.
Right.
You used to say something else. Growing up, you used to say something else, so they changed it somewhere.
Well, we used to say the Mass has ended, go in peace. But
Mass has ended, go in peace. But same with the parable of the Good Samaritan. Jesus ends it by saying, "Go and do likewise." So when we leave Mass, what's our expectation? I think a lot of Catholics know the expectation prior to Mass and in Mass. But Father, what's the expectation of Catholics after Mass for the whole week before they go back?
What does the church expect of them, or what do they expect of themselves?
Both.
Well, you know, as I see people come up to communion in all various kinds of ways, very casually or very fervently, you know, you think some people are just walking up the aisle, they're gazing around, you know, they have their hands in their pocket or something, and I don't know if they're mentally, spiritually getting ready to receive the Lord. I would imagine that person leaves church in the same state that he came, that, you know, that it didn't make a whole lot of difference for his spiritual life. But those others who are very fervent about that and really understand and know that Jesus is present there, you know, when we say go now and be at peace, but proclaim the gospel to the world, that I'm sure that they have that kind of intention to make their lives meaningful in the world as they leave the church and go about their business. It's not an easy thing because you know, we get distracted as human beings and we have to go back home, we have to do dishes, or we have to, you know, clean the house or whatever we have to do on a Sunday, watch the Seahawks or whatever it is. You know, there are other things that have priority sometimes in our lives, and we have to be able to focus, you know.
Right.
And that's an ongoing process.
And I think what communion does, and especially what Mass does, and what we've lost during the pandemic in a way, is our connectedness as a community of people who are gathered around the idea, not more than the idea, for the Catholic Church and for Catholics, the truth that the Eucharist is Jesus's body and blood, and spirit and soul and divinity. what am I missing something? This body, blood, spirit, soul, divinity, all of it. The source and
Yeah.
summit. We during the pandemic we missed out on that. A lot of people have, or at least for the majority of people who were mass goers. I'm hoping that when we're able to come back together, we'll see sort of a reinvigoration of love for the mass. Do you think we can get there?
Well, oh yeah, I have to believe that because I'm a priest.
Have faith. Have that faith in that.
So yeah, of course we have to, with this pandemic, we're looking at things a whole lot differently in our lives and in our religion and everything else. And certainly for those people who are watching on their computers or their TV screens, the mass live streamed, or that they feel that connection to church, to community, but as you say, they don't receive the Eucharist and can't from their homes. But I think that in their hearts, these are people who really believe in Jesus and that the Eucharist is the body and blood of Christ, and they long for the time when they can get back to church and receive Eucharist once again. And hopefully when they do, after a long absence, that they will have a deeper appreciation of Eucharist and what it means to them, and it becomes a real living kind of event in their lives, not just a routine thing that we do every Sunday.
Well, that is certainly what I'll pray for, and I'm sure what you're praying for, and the rest of our community can pray for too.
Right. Okay.
Well, Father, thanks for doing this again with me. We'll be back next week.
Next week.
Next week.
All right.
All right. Thanks, Father.
Take care.